Chapter 3 of The Evil Within 2 is absolutely phenomenal. Its ghost town of sorts is in my mind a perfect example of how an open world should be designed around the game it's featured in, and it's one of the finest slices of video game horror you'll ever likely encounter. Before we delve a little deeper into exactly why that's the case, allow me to very quickly set the scene. You once again take control of series protagonist Sebastian Castellanos after he finds out that his daughter Lily, who he thought was dead, may not be quite as dead as he assumed. Lily is instead being used to power a dream world of sorts, a town named Union, using a machine called STEM, and so Sebastian heads inside this imaginary but also sort of real dreamscape to investigate. Cue some scary build-up, plenty of grrr, I'm an angry dad stuff. Seriously, is anyone else bored of main characters who are really angry dads? And a bit of scene setting. Once that's all done and dusted, you're left to your own devices to explore Union, and this is the point where The Evil Within 2 suddenly gets really good. Open world games are, for me, a blight on modern gaming. There's just so many of them, and they're often attached to games I want to play but don't have the time to thanks to their bloat, like the more recent Assassin's Creed titles, or are included in games which never really needed them to begin with. I'm looking at you, Halo Infinite, you little rascal. Occasionally, I will get sucked into one and genuinely enjoy it. The Witcher 3 is in my view one of the best games ever made, and I did enjoy travelling across its world, but on the whole, I think they're used a lot by developers to create the perception of value. A game featuring 10, maybe 15 hours of good content suddenly becomes a 50-hour extravaganza once an overly large open world filled with a million repetitive fetch quests and similar has been bolted onto it. And that's a shame, because that extra, uninspired, often rather boring nonsense can often end up detracting from the good stuff that's had a little more attention paid to it during development. The Evil Within 2, however, goes a different route, and it's all the better for it. Everything in the open world of Union feels like it's been tailored towards crafting a compelling horror experience, and I think it's fair to say that developer Tango Gameworks scored a home run. The Evil Within 2 is almost exactly what I'd imagined an open-world survival horror game might be like when I was younger. You see, I grew up during what I'd describe as Resident Evil's peak years, from the mid-90s to the early noughties, and as a fan of survival horror who was frankly blown away by the release of Grand Theft Auto 3 in 2001, I daydream constantly about how the two series could be combined. An open-world Raccoon City you had to explore while scavenging enough items to survive the zombies and other monsters infesting the city would have really been my jam. Union may not be the size of a city, in fact far from it, yet in many other ways it is essentially what I've just described. Make no mistake about it, your first few exploratory trips into the town are going to be hard work. You've barely any resources or weapons, and to begin with, the amount of lost, zombies by another name, and other creatures roaming the streets feels a little unfair. Soon enough, however, you'll have found enough components to craft a few more handgun bullets, or if you're really lucky, you'll track down the parts needed to create a sniper rifle relatively early on. Larger items, like the sniper rifle, will often be signposted by signals you can track using a special communicator you're given, but less important items, such as bullets and the like, which are pretty thin on the ground, usually won't be. An excellent balance is struck between holding your hand enough that you'll likely find at least some of the more important equipment you'll need, and leaving you to your own devices to search for everything else. Consequently, even though you don't feel completely helpless, every journey into the town still feels like it could be your last, as you're continually forced to make difficult choices. Do you push on deeper into Union with the items you've already managed to scavenge during your current trip, or call it quits and return to base while you still can? Do you attempt to sneak by the horde of Lost, guarding what looks like a juicy item, risking death if you're spotted while surrounded by them, or do you use your remaining ammo to take them down from a safe distance? These are very similar questions to those you have to answer when playing an old-school Resident Evil title, but transplanted into a more open setting than any featured in those games. Much like Capcom's trend-setting survival horror series, during The Evil Within 2's early stages especially, every moment, every small decision feels like it could have dire consequences should you not choose the correct course of action. It's really blooming tense pretty much all of the time. Of course, you hopefully will eventually find enough stuff that your inventory isn't quite as empty as it was when you first stepped out into the town, but even then, there's no guarantee you'll escape every situation unscathed. That balance, evident throughout the chapter, helps ensure that every successful trip further into the unknown brings with it an enormous sense of satisfaction, as it really does feel like you've earned every bullet, every healing item, and every weapon you come across. The game's early focus on resource management, a survival horror staple, is definitely very well executed, but it would all be for naught if Union itself wasn't well designed too. Thankfully, it makes a lot of sense. As mentioned, the town is not a huge one. Looking at the map, you can see that there are 2 horizontal roads, one each at the bottom and top of the area, connected by 3 paths, 2 towards the left side and 1 on the right, a classic 3-lane layout. This setup, I think, could be scaled to an environment of a certain size, but it's really best used in small to medium-sized areas, and is particularly prevalent in games featuring online multiplayer, whether that be League of Legends or Call of Duty, and in horror terms, it's also used in Resident Evil 4's opening village sequence. It's a layout you can easily remember and navigate smoothly, but most importantly, it's one that's very appropriate for The Evil Within 2. A map much bigger than that of Chapter 3's would have been a disaster for the game. The more time is spent travelling through empty space, the more time there is for you to be less scared and more bored. Because of the way The Evil Within 2's map is structured, with the focus placed more on moving through a small to medium-sized familiar layout at ground level, with very little verticality included, there's never any feeling of monotony. Enemies, items, and nooks and crannies to explore are so dense within its space that you're nearly always moving from one thing to the next with minimal downtime in between them. The issue with including an open world in your game is that controlling pacing becomes a nightmare, as while you can subtly guide people using environmental cues, like a lit street or enemy placement in The Evil Within 2 for example, you can never be sure they'll head in the right direction or how long it will take for them to move between more intense moments. Union, however, is stuffed full of so many things to discover in a space that can quickly and easily be understood that no matter what direction you head in, there's always going to be something of interest nearby. It's open enough that you feel like you have a good amount of agency in how you progress, but it's not too open or hard to navigate that you're left suffering through periods of extended downtime. If the resource management and item hunting I talked about earlier works to help keep things lovely and tense as you explore Union, then its size and layout serves to keep the game's pace high through familiarity with its map and its limited complexity. But there is one more thing that makes these early stages so tremendous, one I consider to be The Evil Within 2's X factor, and that is how dynamic the whole thing feels. To be totally honest, it's actually pretty mind-blowing how much Tango managed to pack in and just how much they decided to mess with you in a single chapter. Chapter 3's Union is incredibly rich in unexpected scares and unique encounters. Some of them are small. You might, for example, come across a truck and open the back to see what's inside, at which point you're ambushed by a group of Lost. Or you may have your celebrations dampened after finding the crossbow as a fire hydrant bursts open, alerting a horde of nearby enemies. There are even several hallucinations of sorts to deal with too, and I could honestly highlight about 10 more examples of little moments littered throughout the town. Then there are the somewhat more involved sequences, this creepy priest being my personal favourite. You discover him in his church and then soon after have to fill the holy man full of holes as he takes a turn for the worst. And then there's this woman you spot fleeing a crowd of Lost. If you rescue her, you're given the opportunity to ask a few questions and take any supplies you need from her hideout. Finally, there are the big ticket events. At one point, it's possible to find yourself briefly transported back to the Beacon Mental Hospital from the original Evil Within. It's not the longest section in the world, but it's a pretty impressive one nonetheless, especially considering it's very easy to miss it altogether. Perhaps my favourite in the entire game is the introduction to Anima. You'll be exploring a fairly normal home, pick up a book which talks about an unseen presence, and then again be transported to the Beacon Mental Hospital, this time all the while being stalked by a seriously unsettling ghost, who will shortly after begin appearing every now and then in Union as well to bother you. You know what's so great about these many individual moments? Is that the majority of them aren't advertised in advance. There's no minimap covered in a stupid amount of icons in all directions, there's no boxes on screen listing out your objectives, or arrows, markers or similar telling you where you need to go. Yes, there are 2 official side quests included in the chapter, but that's it, the rest is up to you. Tango trusts you to go out and have a spine-tinglingly good time without babying you every step of the way, and for me, that's fantastic. 3 things combine perfectly to make The Evil Within 2's third chapter absolutely sing: the focus on tough but familiar survival horror gameplay in a more open setting than usual, the sensible map which combines an easily understood structure with an appropriate size, and the sheer amount of unexpected events which are stuffed into every corner of this section of Union. I am a huge horror fan who has played a huge number of horror games, and it is an experience that left a massive impression on me due to just how unexpectedly amazing it ended up being. The rest of The Evil Within 2, I don't mind, it's still pretty good and I definitely recommend giving it a go, but its third chapter you absolutely must play. I truly believe it to be something very, very special. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and overly angry detectives. If you had a frighteningly good time, do consider liking, subscribing and letting me know what you thought of the video, and fingers crossed, I'll catch you all again soon.